Medicine's Office of Inclusion and Diversity. Welcome to the Diversity Dialogue, the Coastal GasLink Pipeline and Indigenous Health, Strategies of Resistance and Solidarity in the COVID-19 era and beyond. This month is National Indigenous History Month, and this past Sunday was National Indigenous Peoples Day. So this is an important time to recognize Indigenous heritage, diversity, and culture, and celebrate the achievements of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Although we should do this year-round as well. And it's also an important time to be reflective on the responsibilities of those of us who are non-Indigenous settlers, and also think about how we can take action to disrupt settler colonialism in Canada and act in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. Today's speakers will provide a background of the pipeline, explore the detrimental risks that the Coastal GasLink or CGL pipeline poses to Indigenous well-being and public health, as well as highlight strategies employed by activists in healthcare and university settings as they organize in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en land defenders. Today we will have a 15-minute panel discussion followed by 30 minutes of audience question and answer. The chat is disabled, but you can post your questions at any time in the Q&A section. There are many people who have joined, so we might not get to everyone's question today, but we hope the conversation will continue in your own spaces after the event. Captions are available at the bottom of your screen. A post-webinar survey will be displayed at the end of the webinar, and it will also be emailed out to all attendees tomorrow, so we hope you'll be able to take a moment to fill it out. I will now welcome Anita Balakrishna, Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity at the Faculty of Medicine's Office of Inclusion and Diversity, to provide a land acknowledgement and reflection.
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy and honored to be here and to share this land acknowledgement with you all. So we'll start with the U of T land acknowledgement that's been created. It's definitely not the only land acknowledgement that is done, but this is the one that we have been using to start off events here at the Faculty of Medicine. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. This sacred land was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And of course, many folks joining this session today are dialing in from different parts of Turtle Island. And so I'd like to encourage people to think about and learn about the land and the territory that you're on. This land acknowledgement is a crucial starting point in any conversations related to equity, diversity, and inclusion in our institutions. The importance of the land acknowledgement to me is to take some moments to reflect on a few things. Today, I'd like us to reflect on our own positionality as we prepare ourselves to listen and learn from these wonderful speakers in this webinar today. So the first reflection I'm proposing is to start with ourselves, taking a few moments now to think about our own relationship with this land. Unless we are Indigenous to this land, we or our ancestors have arrived from another place, either by choice or not. How did we come to be here on this land? Who are we in relation to it? What does it mean for us? The second reflection is to think about how our presence on this land is connected to the self-determination and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. What is it that we can do to support Indigenous rights? How can we support and move forward the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action? How can we act in allyship and solidarity? The third reflection for today, for me, is to think about the time we are in right now and how it is connected to the historical and current oppressions of Indigenous peoples. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement and ongoing protests, and the continuing Wet'suwet'en resistance and activism, along with other movements led by Indigenous peoples around the globe, it's important to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have consistently suffered from greater health issues, anti-Indigenous racism, and other forms of systemic oppressions. It's also important to acknowledge the resistance, activism, and resilience of Indigenous peoples and their spirits. For me, it is really important to think about Indigenous people's history and Awareness Month in Canada. And it's really important to take the time to learn, educate ourselves, and stay committed to supporting and showing solidarity with our Indigenous friends, colleagues, community members during these very challenging times. Equity, diversity, inclusion really do not have any relevance for us if we don't first acknowledge our responsibility to the original inhabitants of this land. So thank you very much. And I really look forward to the conversations that are going to follow.
Thank you so much, Anita. So I'm now going to read the bios of all the fantastic speakers we have today. Dr. Vanina Stezenbach is Assistant Professor Teaching Stream in the Department of Social Justice Education at OISE, University of Toronto. Her research focuses on nation building and racism in South America and the responsibilities of witnessing. Currently, she is conducting research projects in 2 areas: the role of South American nations within a global racial hierarchy and the ethical questions faced by educators and scholars who mobilize narratives of violence in their work. She is a member of the Jackman Humanities Institute Working Group Rethinking Policing, Penality, and Pandemic, and a creator of the Quick Sandbox, a digital space that explores the ethical questions and responsibilities related to the study of social injustice and oppression. Vanina is a co-founder of the Latin American Queer Education Project and SJE Solidarity with Wet'suwet'en, and a member of Faculty for Palestine. Dr. Willow Fixin is an Anishinaabe Cree Métis medical student currently studying at the University of BC. She's on student council as the Aboriginal health representative and is helping develop an eco-health club movement towards divestment at UBC. The destruction of the land and water, as well as the deteriorating climate conditions, affect Indigenous people disproportionately, something she is acutely aware of as she grew up in Treaty 8 territory, home of the oil tar sands. This knowledge of disparity fuels her to create change as she feels there is an obligation to leave a healthy environment for future generations. Diane Simon is Mi'kmaq from the Fort Folly First Nations in New Brunswick. Her background is in social justice activism, which includes the anti-globalization movements, establishing a student-run food bank at York University, and speaking out against the corporatization of institutions. Although a prison abolitionist, she co-founded a reading program for incarcerated women in Nova Scotia that has been running on a volunteer basis for the past 16 years. As a trained midwife and healthcare provider, she's working towards creating culturally relevant and respectful primary care while buffering systems that disproportionately target Indigenous families and communities. Rooted in her culture and community, she's raising 3 boys and starting her 2nd year in the Master of Public Health program through Dalai Lama. Sarah Hyatt is a non-Indigenous settler and 2nd year medical student at U of T. Sarah believes that medical students have a responsibility to support Indigenous climate justice, including the Wet'suwet'en resistance to the CGL pipeline, as this inherently is tied to Indigenous health and well-being. As such, she's working on an initiative to collect signatures on a solidarity statement from learners at the Faculty of Medicine in support of the Wet'suwet'en land defenders. Prior to attending medical, Sarah has had the privilege of working with Indigenous communities and scholars both academically during her master's in health research methodology at McMaster University and non-academically in various community contexts. As a settler, she is not an expert on Indigenous perspectives of health and does not presume to speak for Indigenous peoples or communities, but aims to educate and promote awareness among her other non-Indigenous peers. So we're so grateful to have these 4 amazing speakers here with us today. And I'm now going to hand it over to Vanina to take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to start out by sharing my screen with you. So just give me a moment to do that. And while I'm doing that, I'd like to thank Anita and Shannon for organizing this panel and for inviting me to be on it. I'm humbled to be on this panel, and I would also like to say that I'm also not here speaking for Wet'suwet'en people. I'm here speaking in solidarity, and would like to start out by thanking the Wet'suwet'en land defenders who are defending the land and water for all of us. So today I've been asked, so I just want to know, am I sharing right now? Okay, great. Thank you. So today I've been asked to provide you with some some background on the CGL pipeline and some updates on construction, as well as some ways that we, as I'm part of the group SJE Solidarity with Wet'suwet'en, so I will share with you some ways that we have supported the struggle and some ways that you can become involved. So to begin with, this first slide is a map of the area that will be affected by the pipelines, and that would be running through Wet'suwet'en territory. So first of all, I want to point out that it's actually, there are 3 pipelines that are proposed. The first one is the one we are talking about today, CGL, and it would run about 670 kilometers across through Wet'suwet'en territory, across what is known as northern BC. Another proposed pipeline also in the same region is the Chevron Pacific Trails pipeline, which would run 480 kilometers. And the third one is the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, which would be over 1,100 kilometers and would run from what is known as Alberta to British Columbia. So I want to highlight that, and here I'm having oh, there we go. The pipeline project is illegal. Wet'suwet'en land territory is unceded territory. When you hear the Canadian government say that they have consent, they are talking about the band council chiefs, and the band leaders are actually get their authority from the Indian Act, a colonial act. So here I am sharing on this slide, it's a graphic that was created by the artist Chloe Germain-Terrien, and it shows the difference, the distinction between the band council chiefs and the hereditary chiefs. Whereas the band council gets their authority from the crown, the hereditary chiefs derive their authority from Wet'suwet'en governance. They are the only ones who have the ability to provide consent for what can be done on the territory. And in this, with this authority comes their responsibility and their accountability to Wet'suwet'en people and also to the next 7 generations. And this authority has been recognized in a Supreme Court decision in 1997. So, in fact, the pipeline is in violation of Wet'suwet'en law. It's in violation of UNDRIP, the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. And it's also in violation of the BC Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Running not only 1, but 3 pipelines through this territory carries grave environmental risks as well as endangering Indigenous people's health. And I know that that the next panelists will be filling you in on those risks and what is actually happening right now. But I want to point out that in addition to the health risks, the pipeline would also endanger the lives of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited people. And so this was actually flagged by the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which was released last year. And this report highlighted the ways that extraction projects and the work camps connected to these projects, also known as man camps, the way that they are related to increases in violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited peoples. And this connection was violently reinforced on February 10th, 2020. As you may recall, this was the date that the RCMP invaded the Unistoten camp. This is the camp set up on Wet'suwet'en territory to resist the pipeline. And during this invasion happening during a ceremony that the matriarchs were conducting in honor of MMIW. This slide depicts another illustration by Chloe Germain-Terrien, and it shows the matriarchs conducting the ceremony. So during this day, when the RCMP invaded, they actually arrested 7 people, including Wet'suwet'en's spokesperson and matriarch, Freda Hewson. Now, 4.5 months later, we're into a pandemic, and it is egregious that pipeline construction continues. Back in March, when the BC government was asking people to stay home and limiting gatherings, CGL was actually bringing people onto the territory. So they were bringing in transient workers who come from all over the place. What I'm showing you here on this slide is an image that comes from APTN News, and it shows a motel in the region, Houston, BC, with the trucks of CGL workers. And as we know, CGL, wherever, when they show up, they are always backed up by their enforcers, their state enforcers, the RCMP. So bringing in all these people from all over the place into the region poses a very enormous risk of the introduction of coronavirus into Indigenous communities, and indeed this is already happening. I will leave it to my co-presenters to fill you in on the health risks and the health aspects. But what I would like to emphasize now is that Wet'suwet'en people have been resisting. And they have been fighting the pipeline for a long time, using all means at their disposal. They have been using court challenges, blockades, petitions. They have been building cabins. There is the Unistoten camp, including many cabins and a healing center. And I had the opportunity to hear Colin Kanahus, who is part of Indigenous Youth for Wet'suwet'en, and he is the son of her hereditary chief. And during this webinar, he was describing the way that they are asserting their authority on the territory by driving around, by checking things out, by documenting the incursions from CGL who are bringing in equipment. They are putting CGL on notice and letting them know that the pipeline will not be built. Right now, they're also resisting the Alberta government, who has increased their repression of the protests. In May, Alberta Energy Minister Sonia Savage actually went on the record as saying that a pandemic is an excellent time to build a pipeline because people can't gather. And indeed, Jason Kenney has actually, he introduced and has now, his party has passed a bill which is known as the Critical Infrastructure Bill, Critical Infrastructure Act, which restricts dissent. This, under this act, people who protest against sites that are considered critical infrastructure, and this includes a whole range of sites, pipelines, railways, and as railways, it includes telecommunications. All of these sites, people who protest are subject to fines of up to $25,000 and or up to 6 months in jail. So as you can see, in what I'm showing you on this slide is another image by Chloe Germain-Terrien depicting the different forms of protests and showing that, why blockades are important, despite the inconveniences that they might cause. And since the disruption of infrastructure has been such a key part of the protest of the pipelines, it's very obvious that this is a targeted bill. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to join in a specific action that targets the bill. So, of course, all of this is outrageous and infuriating. So now I want to turn to a conversation of what you can do. While this situation might seem bleak, the Wet'suwet'en Nation inspire us, and they provide us with this gift, which is the Unistoten Camp Supporter Toolkit. And they provide us with a very clear guideline of how we can support them. So I'll turn to a discussion of how our group, SJE Solidarity with Wet'suwet'en, a group that was founded by myself and by some students in my Department of Social Justice Education, as well as other departments at the University of Toronto, how we formed, we came together in February in order to respond to the calls for action from Wet'suwet'en and from particularly from the Unistoten camp. And so, as you can see on this slide, which is taken from their website, they list very specific calls to action. They say you can come to the land, although this has been suspended right now due to the pandemic, but there are still many other things that you can do. You can fundraise, you can educate, as we're doing right now with this webinar. You can build solidarity, you can pressure the government, both federal and provincial levels, donate, and I encourage you to follow the link in order to find, there you will find a lot of the resources needed to take action. But what I want to highlight is that as SJE Solidarity with Wet'suwet'en, we take our instructions directly from this toolkit. And I want to emphasize this relationship because right now, as Anita mentioned, there is an outpouring of outrage at all the violence that we are seeing against Black people, against Indigenous people, and it's important for people to act. And in acting, I think it's important that we listen to those who are on the front lines of these struggles, that we listen to those who have been spearheading these movements for years and for decades. And so while we can't afford to despair, what we can do is we can listen to the instructions, we can learn and to those who are on the front lines, and we can act in solidarity. So I'll speak to you briefly about some of the actions that we have taken. Here is how you can contact us if you're interested. But one of the first things that we did when we formed was write a statement in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en, and it was endorsed by our department and several other departments at the university. I heard that you also have your own statement, but wherever you're located, this is something that you can do, and they will post it on their website. And it is very powerful when you go on the website and you see that there are statements from all over the world, hundreds. So this is indeed, this puts CGL and the government on notice that this is in fact a global movement and the pipeline is not going to be built. We also held a teach-in back in March, early March, when we could still all meet. But once the pandemic hit, we started to think about ways that we could still keep showing solidarity while sheltering at home, particularly since the media attention was now primarily on COVID, and there was not as much attention on the fact that pipeline construction was still happening, that this was still an issue. So we have supported calls to action. We have organized Zoom meetings. So for example, I'll show you, this comes from one of our actions where we all got together on Zoom to make signs. And this was for Wet'suwet'en Solidarity Week. I'm a novice at this, so this isn't a great example of a graphic, but I just wanted to show it to you. So we gathered together on Zoom and created these signs. This action was inspired by an activist, Indigenous activist, who goes by the name of Tapioca Starch. And people were making signs and posting them on Instagram or on social media, as well as on their windows and their doors. So all over, from coast to coast, and even all over the place, people have been posting these signs. And it sends, again, this sends a very clear message of solidarity. Some other actions have involved doing communications blockades. So that means blocking the lines by tweeting, by emailing, by phoning the companies that are investing in CGL. Two of these companies that we have blockaded or that we have done these blockades for are KKR and AIMCO. And what we have found, again, we get together on Zoom to do this, so much as we would have done in person prior to the pandemic. And we find it powerful to actually re-energize each other by doing it together. And we have actually met up with activists from other parts of the world, including the UK, as we are doing this. As the weeks have passed, we have also joined solidarity actions with actions in solidarity with migrant workers, as well as those that are protesting anti-Black violence and anti-Indigenous violence by the police. And this weekend, we will be supporting the Afro-Indigenous Rising Camp at Nathan Phillips Square, which is happening, for those of you who are outside of Toronto, it's happening here in Toronto. And the expansion of our solidarity work has happened organically. We understand that the struggle against CGL is linked to the struggle against settler colonialism, the struggle against racial capitalism, against anti-Black racism, against the violence of borders and imperialism. And as we understand that these struggles are all linked. So while we remain focused on raising awareness that the pipeline construction is ongoing and that the health crisis is urgent, we are also in solidarity with the many interlinked movements that are organizing for transformative change and are invested in a future that centers decolonization, Indigenous sovereignty, and Black liberation. So before ending, I would like to invite you to join a short, quick action. I'm going to ask you to follow the link that is here, and I think it will be pasted as well for you in the chat. And this is a petition to rescind Critical Infrastructure Act, and you can do this, it will just take you a minute or two. And you can do this while as I am ending, and encourage your family members, your friends to also sign, use social media to spread this. If you would like to get in touch with us, please contact us, and I can share our contact information, and I'm happy to share these slides as well. So I'd like to end by once again thanking the land defenders. The Wet'suwet'en remind us that there is power in struggle and there is power in solidarity. So thank you very much, and I really look forward to listening to my fellow panelists and to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Steenboek. I now would like to invite Dr. Dixon to speak.
All right, thank you for that good rundown, Vanina. It kind of saves me some airtime in terms of explaining what's happening. As I was presenting or thinking about what I was going to talk about, the discussion from beginning to end of what's happening is so complex it could be almost its course in and of itself. So I'm going to start by sharing slides with you so that you guys can see what I'm talking about. It's mostly just for me to have kind of context or reminder of where I'm going more than it is. Uh-oh. Okay. Did that work? Yes? Okay. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction in terms of why this matters to me. There was a good introduction provided, but I think that there's more context that I don't normally tell people. So my name's Willow Fixin. I am Cree, Anishinaabe, and Métis, but I grew up in Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 territory. And what that means for me is my dad is from Michelle First Nation. He is Cree and Haudenosaunee, and our family goes all the way up to Treaty 8, right by Dawson Creek, in the heart of the fracking industry. I grew up in the tar sands in Fort McMurray for half of my life. I have seen the land be destroyed, our animals be destroyed. I have watched our food supplies decrease. I have watched the amount of land that we have to traditionally harvest our food and our medicines decrease, and the capacity that our people feel that they have to assert sovereignty slowly diminish. And for me, over time, that's tragic and really, really sad. And so to give you context, that's where I come from. But I did a whole bunch of work in my bachelor's degree, and now I'm a medical student. Well, I'm not really a medical student anymore, graduated, now physician, MD, but I'm taking a year off to do a master's in clinical epidemiology so that I can further research kind of the impacts of these extractive processes longitudinally and the impacts on Indigenous health, both from extractive processes and in my other passions through medicine. So I used to be the local officer of Indigenous health for those in medicine that understand what that is. It's Canadian Federation of Medical Students. It's our student government. And then I became a national officer of Indigenous health, which coordinated all of the local officers across Canada. So I got to speak to every single medical school and all of their Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students that were advocates for Indigenous health. I worked with Finola Hackett, who was doing the heart work, which is the climate advocacy work through the Canadian Federation of Medical Students. And so we kind of teamed up because there's a lot of Indigenous issues that are climate related and a lot of Indigenous issues that are not climate related. And at some point we have to not be the only ones caring. There's a lot of Indigenous people doing work and people get burned out, but that's a whole other topic. So I've done all of this stuff, and currently I've been a board member for the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment since 2017. And that's where I do a lot of my advocacy work and try and bring an Indigenous lens on climate work through the medicine advocacy physicians department, one of our many CanMeds competencies for those of you that are in medicine and are joining us. So now that you know a little bit about me, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. This is a very, very kind of blurry screen. You saw a little bit previously about what this means. So if you look in your top right, you see Dawson Creek, Chetwynd, Hudson's Hope, Fort St. John, my family's territory. I got rambling and I'm sorry. I forgot to acknowledge that I'm not where you guys are. For those of you that are in Toronto, I am currently in Coast Salish territory, the home of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. That is not my territory. I'm a guest on their land. Even though I'm Indigenous, I cannot speak for the people whose land I'm on, and I cannot speak for the Wet'suwet'en people. Gratefully, I have been there to the Unistoten camp, which I'll talk about in 2 seconds. But I'm going to start at the beginning, which is in your top right, because that's where I'm from. That's where I grew up. That's where I hunt moose. That's where I berry pick. That's where I collect medicines. And the fracking, everybody has known in my territory that fracking causes health problems. We've seen it. We've seen weird cancers. We've cut cancers out of our moose and we just eat it anyways. We've cut weird tumors and growths and everybody just is like, okay, that's whatever. Because that's just how we have to live. Sadly, there is not an abundant amount of research on the health effects of fracking for a lot of reasons. There's a growing body of evidence, but fracking uses a very specific chemical mixture that they don't give out to the public. So you have no idea what carcinogens are in there. They're like, this is, corporate information. You can't have it. It's our trade secret kind of thing. And so how do you study something that you have no idea what it is? From a PhD perspective or somebody who's doing research, you're just taking best guesses. Okay, well, they could be using this to extract the oil from the ground. What's happening now, which is nice, is there's a growing body of toxicologists. A good friend and incredible toxicologist here in Canada, Elise Caron-Baudouin, who's now going to be at the U of T. She came from Montreal. She did a bunch of research back in 2017, 2018, looking at volatile organic compounds and heavy metals in pregnant women. And we all know that increasing heavy metals in pregnant women or in small children impedes development. You look at grassy narrows and places like that where there have been higher lead and higher heavy metals, creating a significant drop in IQ and significant developmental delays in all children, pretty much, which is tragic and sad and not okay. But there was no way to trace fracking in this. Now Elise is starting to put together those pieces. She was taking hair and urine and nail samples of pregnant women and comparing them to not people that are in the general population. So there's a Canadian database that says, okay, we're going to allow this amount of selenium, this amount of manganese, this amount of aluminum in our bodies. That's what is okay, according to the general population. She was seeing 6 times this normal level in these pregnant women. So you can imagine that these heavy metals at 16 times the national normal population rate in a pregnant woman in these areas. So now we're starting to draw some conclusions, or not some conclusions, some correlations, as we like to use in science, some correlations between areas where there is high fracking in density, which we can only track not through any other study, but via postal code. So you track postal code, where the fracking wells are. You can't really do non-Indigenous, you just kind of do sampling and then separate Indigenous from non-Indigenous by self-identifying through the sampling. So it's like a random sample of women that want to come in. So this is one of the few studies that has actually shown some increased correlations between fracking and the health effects. So what does this have to do with CGL? Well, that's the beginning of it. It goes from Alberta all the way down, as Vanine kindly showed, the 3 separate areas. So what's happening in the Wet'suwet'en territory is that they've asserted their sovereignty. As was nicely outlined for us, not all communities are on the same page. In fact, none are that I've ever been to or met. Indigenous people have very different ideas, come from different places. We have a long history of intergenerational traumas and genocides, and people have different ideas of what's best for their people. We have the Indian Act, which has, as was described, this chief and council, which is trying to be in the best for their nation and make some decisions for their nation. Sometimes they're like, okay, well, we want jobs. We want our people to have jobs. What does that mean for us? Well, maybe Coastal GasLink and the pipeline is going to produce jobs for the short time. That will get maybe our people out of poverty. That's an arguably good idea. The pipeline, not a good idea. And it has divided the community. I'm not from that community, so I'm just speaking from my experiences being up there. I was at the Unistoten. I have friends that are Wet'suwet'en. I have friends that are Gitxsan. I have friends that are Nisga'a. I've been up there almost every single year. And the whole community is divided. It has caused such a trauma within the community and the neighboring communities because of this fight. That trauma and that division of people has families fighting against each other for something that they shouldn't have to fight for. Indigenous people are sovereign over their territories. They are unceded. I come from a treaty territory. We have different rules, different laws. We have a very distinct reservation system. We're not unceded. Unceded means that territory is theirs. They have sovereignty. By the government of Canada not respecting those chief sovereignty, they are undermining and being racist. They're saying, okay, well, we've given you these, but you know, we want some money. Now we're going to take them back. Now it's not yours anymore. We're going to take it back. Now I understand you want to protect the water and you want to protect the land, and we gave that to you in like a small parcel, but we want it now, so we're going to take it back, and we're going to use the RCMP to trample all over your rights. And so I use rights in quotation because it's much something that they say we have and then we actually don't. And so this goes into this whole UNDRIP situation. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that is something that is being used in political platforms for Indigenous voting. It is an incredible idea, and it is something Canada says, oh, we are going to implement, we are going to stand behind it, we are going to support Indigenous people the way that they need to be supported in anti-racist movement and support their sovereignty over traditional lands, medicine, health, in all of these ways. And from a health perspective, they have actually said that UNDRIP supports our right for unceded territory to protect our medicine, to protect our water, to protect our land. It provides us the right to access without discrimination all social and health access. That doesn't happen. I'm going to bring up a story that was told to me by one of the Wet'suwet'en people in Unistoten recently. Everybody in the camp has been there protecting the land, protecting the water, protecting the ceremony sites as they are sovereign and allowed to do on their own territory. They've been there for years and years and years and years. And there was a person there who needed medical help. The police were raiding, wouldn't let anybody leave. This person needed medical help and at some point was allowed to leave. But they were so torn within themselves. If I leave, I can't come back. The RCMP isn't going to allow me back. So they were sitting there struggling, and at some point they needed to go. Turns out that person had stage 4 cancer. So now they're terminal. And so how would it have been stage 4 if they wouldn't have been sitting there struggling with their own Indigenous ideals and ethics to be like, this is my land, this is what I stand for. If I leave, there's going to be less people here, because less people means that they have a stronger power hold over us. We have less people on the land, we have less land. That is our struggle as Indigenous people. And so this person, this is one of the many health repercussions of Wet'suwet'en, is they're standing up for their rights, they're standing up for what was given to them. And now they're suffering because of it. People couldn't leave and come back, seek the health services that they needed in order to survive. And now this person is terminal and trying to go back and forth from the Unistoten. There are other conflicts within the hereditary chiefs that has caused so much stress. They've had guns pointed at their heads just for asserting their sovereignty. People have had to step away from the Unistoten, even though they've been there for 6-7 years, because they have been under so much stress from not coming and going, from their families fighting, from the RCMP constantly worrying if there's going to be a raid on them, or there's going to be guns at their head, or they're going to be able to get food in there. That kind of stress is what is embedded in systemic racist healthcare. So we have this situation at the Unistoten where all they're doing is asserting their land and sovereignty. You can go around, build a pipeline somewhere else. The pipelines have millions of dollars of money, billions. I don't know how much they have, a lot. I can imagine that Wet'suwet'en territory that they're trying to protect is not large in the grand scheme of British Columbia. So is it a difficult situation to avoid the Unistoten, to avoid Wet'suwet'en territory? I'm not a proposed designer or engineer, and I'm not saying that a proposed alternate pathway is a good idea because it's going to go through other Indigenous territories as well. What I'm saying is, like, we have to at some point respect Indigenous people. And what we're saying as a Canadian government is, we don't respect you. We don't respect your health. We don't respect your rights, and we don't respect your sovereignty. And to me, that is not okay. That's not okay for us to do from a health perspective. Nobody was sending nurses or doctors or anybody to check up on these people as they were asserting their rights. And nobody was giving them access to healthcare without them not being able to come back. This is not okay. So what they're saying, this is the message that the Canadian government is telling Indigenous people. And so now we have this pandemic. The pipeline has continued to be built. It's putting everybody in danger. The hereditary chiefs have been under so much pressure. There has been a memorandum of understanding signed between the hereditary chiefs and the federal government. This is not an agreement saying, yes, this is okay. We're okay on this. They're not signing off. They're saying we need to be in discussions about the next steps forward. The only reason this has been signed is because everybody's under so much stress. There's this pandemic. There's all of these things that are happening. I'm really hopeful, given this anti-racist movement, although in nature it is anti-Black, which has nothing to do, and I do not want to steal the spotlight from our Black relatives, and I'm calling them relatives because we're innately Indigenous of different lands. But I think that I'm grateful for this anti-racist movement, that I think it's eye-opening for a lot of people to see the relationality and the context in which people of color, Black, Indigenous, etc., have been marginalized and continuously overlooked and undermined in every way possible. So when we think about the Coastal Gas Pipeline, it is one of many scenarios that this undermining and systemic racism has been pushed through for an economic extractive agenda. And the Canadian government is allowing this. And I think it's time now for people to speak up. So things that I've done in my grand mini life so far is, in undergrad, I created, when Enbridge was the first thing, which is the very end of this Coastal GasLink pipeline. Enbridge is going to bring tankers through a really protected area where there's a lot of salmon runs, and salmon are critical to the coastal Indigenous people. Actually, most BC Indigenous people either trade for the salmon or they get the salmon themselves. This is a way that we live. Oh, I meant to do this one. It's the way that we live. The salmon is key. And so this Enbridge thing, I created a panel and hosted a conference with lawyers and environmentalists and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And I had everybody come and ask all of the questions. What does this mean legally? What about settlers' legal rights, or our fishing? Or what does it mean for, the biologists, or for the geologists? What's going to happen to the land? What happens if there's a spill? And so I allowed people to have this open dialogue. I've had podcasts. I used to be on Unceded Airways, which is our radio show, and I would talk about a lot of these issues, trying to bring them to light, because I think what people don't necessarily understand is the context or impact of these projects. And so as a medical student, I would have devil's advocates, other medical students come up and try and, I don't know if they're starting to be they're starting to be a little bit racist, saying, oh, well, what do you think about the pipeline? Like, it's pretty obvious what I think about the pipeline. It's pretty obvious what most Indigenous people think about the pipeline. I'm not saying all people, because as I was talking about before, our nations are divided, and for good reasons. Sometimes there's that money, you know, I want my people to not be poor. And then there's the, I need to protect the land. And it's really easy for me to sit on a high horse in the city with my education and say, oh, I don't want pipelines. I have family that work for pipelines. I have families that lay pipes. They don't want to leave the res because, like I said before, once we're out of the land, we don't have the land. And so they don't want to leave, because once they leave and they get a job elsewhere that might not be an extractive industry, our land gets smaller. We have less people there, less people practicing our culture. We are innately tied to the land. That is who we are. Without land, we have no culture. Without language, we have no culture. Our language is tied to the land and place, and you can't separate either of them. So where do we go from here? This adorable little picture I took. I don't even know who this kid is, FYI. So what next? There's so many different ways to get involved and so many different ways to support anti-racist movements and anti-industry. I'm not entirely advocating to go full-on anti-industry. I think with every single movement, we have extremes in order to get us to a middle ground. So you think about like the feminist movement, braless, topless, all of that stuff, showed us and allowed this middle ground for a little bit more equity. And so now we have these extreme anti-racist movements. And what is this going to leave? I hope this brings us to more racial equity. And so when it comes to things that you can do, you can be involved with CAPE if you're part of the kind of physician world or not. We have a lot of people that are not physicians. There are different chapters for different provinces. So if you're in Ontario, there's the Ontario chapter. You can talk to Dr. Samantha Green or Dr. Edward Yee, I think is how you pronounce the name, X-I-E. I might have butchered that. I think it's Yee, but I'm not sure. You can get involved if you're a medical student with the local officer of Indigenous Health, or contact the Heart Advocacy Group who's working on climate justice. You can do the direct actions from the UNISTO. You can be involved in solidarity movements. You can create movements within your own silo of people. So there's law people, poli-sci people, environment people, fisheries, forestry, all of these different silos of experts have been doing different movements saying, okay, we're midwives with the Unistoten, we're midwives supporting Indigenous sovereignty, we are nurses, we are this, that. There's everybody coming together and supporting it and challenging the government and standing up to the government and saying, hey, this is not okay. We need reform. We need change. We need this because what's happening is it's affecting Indigenous people in health more than they are already affected by the other attempts of genocide. So there's a million things that you can do and a million things to get, a million different ways to be involved. What you have to do is pick what you are capable of. For some people, that's sharing on social media. I'm going to share all of this information because I don't have the emotional capacity necessary or physical capacity or time capacity. This could be going out to protest, starting a protest, signing in with your group or community organization. There's so many ways to be involved. As you saw with the Wet'suwet'en struggle earlier, people are standing up for the solidarity and for the sovereignty of Wet'suwet'en people across Canada. And that meant that almost most Indigenous people really supported what the Wet'suwet'en struggle for sovereignty and struggle to protect their own lands. There was this crazy wildfire movement that's happening similarly with Black Lives Matter. And I think that what's happening is this global unrest. Time to get on board. It's time to stand up. And for those in medicine, we really, really, really need you. It's a very tumultuous place that people are not speaking up for so many different reasons. And as an Indigenous physician, an Indigenous medical student, I need, and my family needs, and my people need your voice right now, because people get very tired being the only people speaking up. So the smallest action is learning how to speak up for those that don't have a voice. Thank you. And hi to all the other speakers. I'm excited. And I'm sorry if that was emotional and ranty.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Dixon. And Ms. Diane Simon, I'd like to now invite you to speak. Thank you.
Okay, great, wonderful. Gwe Waliaksik Ninda Luisan, Diane Simon, Walaliag for the invitation. It's been amazing listening to other speakers. I'm listening and I'm just like, oh, now it's my turn to talk. I'm not quite sure what I can add to all of that. So and I always have to kind of start with just reflecting on my bio. And when I wrote it, I kind of laughed at myself because all of the accomplishments listed are things I'm very, very proud of, things that, you know, I'm really grateful I had the opportunity to participate in and do, but it's also all of those things are the things I tend to leave off my resume and off applications, and it kind of highlights that kind of the conflict that exists between like community activism and academia. And I think it's something as students, when we're in academic institutions, that we're constantly feeling that conflict between. You know, and right now I'm tuning in from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded traditional ancestral territories of the Mi'kmaq, of my family, my people. You know, and we just traveled here from Toronto 2 days ago, and so had, you know, the last week, you know, a lot of reflection on kind of what's happening across Canada, what's happening in Toronto, what's been happening here in New Brunswick, and you know, really kind of being acutely aware of the systemic racism and challenges that exist with government, with police, and Indigenous rights. And so, you know, I'm thinking more about kind of the resistance piece and that needs to happen. You know, coming back to my home territory and thinking about, you know, about community activism and kind of what got me to this point, and, you know, growing up here and learning about Annie Mae and AIM and Wounded Knee, and, you know, Annie Mae was the first missing and murdered Indigenous woman, you know, that I learned about, and so that kind of situated, you know, my growing up. I was young when the standoffs happened in Ganawage and Ganasatage, and I remember, you know, being in school and, you know, how much the media influenced society's perception of Indigenous people and, you know, land defenders and water protectors. And so that really kind of shaped my youth, and it was my first teachings on like social location and about relationships between Indigenous peoples and the government in Canada, and colonial systems. And so you know, I was fortunate to kind of have my path cross with you know, other kind of social activists, and you know, got involved with forestry issues. Forestry is a big issue here in New Brunswick. And so I think that was always very empowering to kind of have those role models help introduce me how to empower myself and how to be involved in how I can make change, right? And so kind of all the different ways of like working within the system, working outside of the system. And I think we need to see that. And I think, you know, when I was younger, I always felt like, you know, kind of doing more of the frontline actions was where I was most comfortable. But now I'm also seeing how working within the system can be effective as well, and that we need both. When my first attempt at university, I mean, it didn't last too long, but I went, and one of the big things that we were doing at the time was about the corporatization of universities. And so this was just slightly before Naomi Klein came out with No Logo. And it was at the very start of exclusive cold beverage agreements that, you know, at universities, like our university was the second one for this to happen. And so my friend and I, there was just two of us, had a 2-person protest to kind of raise awareness on this. And it actually did, because then the university newspaper picked it up, and then that got distributed across Canada, and then so kind of mobilizing student movements. So at the time, like, we didn't have that instant kind of connection as we do now with social media. But at the time, like, so back then it was like the corporatization of university is like big branding, corporate buy-ins, and like the big worry was that how is that going to be influencing education, that when we have these corporations basically buying their ways into universities, and so you have to wonder what kind of influence that's going to have on our education. And now, fast forward to now, and being a student again, and there's less, I find that there's a lot less of that like overt corporatization. However, you know, it very much is a business. Institutions are businesses. And so if that's how it is, then that means our relationship as students is we're consumers. And I know if I spend like $100 on a pair of shoes or on a sweater, I'm expecting quality. I want something back from my investment. Yet with institutions, there's less of that kind of scrutiny happening. And so a lot of the time, universities have all these investments in the big companies and the corporations that we are actually trying to counter. So we come to university with this idea, we want to get an education, we want to improve, you know, our communities, yet at the same time, the university is giving us this education, but behind closed doors is like funneling our money through these corporations. So it's very, it feels very insulting, and the lack of transparency from universities is unacceptable. And so I really think as students, like that's where we can exert some pressure and look at divestment. You know, everywhere else does it, so why can't we have that same accountability and transparency with our academic institutions? I know that there's like big issues now, especially like with COVID. Like initially, the university had already kind of like suggested that there's a possibility of tuition increases because of you know, kind of change of formats, having to invest in like more technology, but it's also reflecting the dip in the market, and that's affecting universities. I mean, we just received an email the other day saying that tuition likely won't be changed, but it's still, that issue is still there, like that connection to those investments and stocks. So moving on. So I think one thing that we have going for us these days is like social media and the instant connections and being able to be on top of like what's going on in other communities, and just the fact that, you know, what's happening elsewhere, I think we're recognizing what happens in another community can happen in our community, and it's really just a matter of time before that happens. And that's why the solidarity across nations really needs to happen. And I think it's always been that divide and conquer mentality in terms of with the government, you know, kind of pick communities off one at a time. But I think having a collective voice is, you know, we have that strength to do that. And I think even in terms of the rail blockades and like those sorts of solidarity actions, even thinking about, you know, the solstice, like in, I think 2007, 2008, it was actually declared the National Day of Action for communities to come out and kind of make our voices heard and be more visible. And I think we need to do more of that. I think what the government always tends to kind of undermine or downplay, or like they just don't get that there's not a compromise in terms of standing up for our rights and our treaty rights, our territories. You know, it is a connection. Our connection to our land is a very direct connection to our health and well-being, and so we can't compromise on that. And the government won't do that to other communities, to non-Indigenous communities. They don't go in and say, okay, we're going to relocate your town, we're going to build this pipeline here. That's unheard of. But somehow it's a double standard. Like, you know, but it's okay for the Indigenous communities. You know, they can build a pipeline, but they can't build water lines. You know, like in 2002, the UN had declared water a basic human right. And right now in Canada, there's 61 communities that have long-term water advisories right now. And so it just boggles my mind that they're like, oh, but we can build an oil pipeline. They have the money for that and the infrastructure to do that, but they can't build indoor plumbing, safe indoor plumbing for families. So yeah, so it's, and again, it all comes back to relationships, right? So like, you know, my life, I've learned about, you know, the relationships, the broken relationships between Indigenous people and the colonial government. And I think, you know, there's opportunity, there's different initiatives that communities are kind of taking on to make connections with other governments, right? Really kind of taking and owning our own sovereignty to be able to do that and to negotiate new agreements with other countries. And I think we need to keep doing that and pushing those boundaries. In terms of our treaty rights, like they're living documents and we have to know them, because I think what the government's clearly shown is that they don't have our interests at heart. They never have. And so it's our responsibility to know what our treaties say and to challenge them constantly. And that's the only way that that we're going to have that protection. In terms of COVID, we're really kind of, it's highlighting all of the inequalities that exist within communities. It really magnifies the disparities. You know, it seems like for public health, it was just like, oh, wash your hands and, you know, socially distance. And that's not possible. Like, and it's still very, like, I still have yet to kind of see those community-based, you know, what's the word? Like recommendations, like how do you do these things when you don't have running water? How do you wash your hands? And then even just like the extra cost to like buy extra water, like it's wild and just such an oversight. It's always like the, you know, Indigenous communities is always like a step or two behind the rest of like every other community, you know, and I think, you know, so there's that, but then it's also, we have the knowledge, we know what's best for our communities when we're given like the opportunity to take it on for ourselves. You know, and I bring up like in Toronto, Name-Res had one of the first positive COVID cases in the shelter system, and with very much on their own, were able to mitigate the risks because they implemented their own system, and it was successful because it didn't spread like wildfire. They were able to do what they for themselves. But then also, you know, the fact that there wasn't any sort of Indigenous testing site, that also came like 2 months later, and even trying to talk to people about it, and it was just, again, getting kind of brushed off. You know, you approach like the MP and he's like, well, yeah, that's important, however, you know, the testing is a provincial mandate, so you need to talk to the province. And then you go to the provincial guy and he's like, oh yeah, but it's First Nations, so you have to go to federal for federal funding. And so always, no matter where we are, we're getting kind of like, we fall through like the cracks, and they won't just, you know, like kind of just let us do what we need to do for our own communities. So yeah, so what it comes down to is that we know what's best for ourselves, and we just have to keep asserting that that space, holding that space for our communities and those to come after us, and just trying to figure out how to let the government, how to make the government give us our autonomy back. And I think things like pipelines, that's not going to help us. But I think the resistance piece is key, is crucial, and we need to figure out how to do that in our lives wherever we are, because it may be happening in one community, but we know if it's happening there, it's going to happen here, right? It's a steamroller, and we all have to stand up and fight it off. And and I keep thinking, like, you know, in terms of being on the front lines, it's important, but it's also, we have to find out where we have power, where we're at. So as students, really kind of pushing for divestment from these corporations. I also think about, it was 30 years ago, Elijah Harper stood up in the legislature and voted against the Mutual Aid Accord, right? And that was one person, and he used his position where he was at to affect change. And I think that's the whole point, is like trying to figure out how we can support one another in our struggles and affect change where we're at. Yeah. So I guess that's my ramble for today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Diane. That was really powerful. And lastly, I'd like to invite Sarah Hyatt to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen with everyone. Okay, can everyone see my slides okay? Maybe Shannon, can you just let me know?
I cannot see them yet.
You can't? Okay, it says I'm screen sharing. I'll try again. Okay, can you see them now?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So my name is Sarah Hyatt, and I'm going to be sharing a perspective kind of from my roles as a medical student and as a health researcher. And in regards to the pipeline, I'm going to be discussing kind of a bit about police brutality, some health perspectives, and then a bit about settler responsibility. So just to introduce myself, like I said in my bio, I'm a non-Indigenous settler, I'm a medical student and a health researcher. So just, I like to say that given that I'm a settler, I'm not an expert on Indigenous perspectives on these topics, and I don't speak for any Indigenous community. However, what I do aim to do is promote critical discussion of the issues that we're talking about today among other non-Indigenous settlers. So there are four main things kind of that I want to talk about today. I'm going to briefly discuss the colonial history of the RCMP and the relevance of that to the present day police brutality and the Wet'suwet'en land defenders. And I'm just going to share some reflections on issues relating to the pipeline from my medical student perspective. Then I'll ask us to consider settler responsibility as it relates to Indigenous climate action solidarity. And then lastly, I just want to tell you all about a medical student-led solidarity statement in support of the Wet'suwet'en land defenders. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about police brutality as it relates to the talk today, because I think it's relevant to the topic of pipelines, and it's been brought up a bit already. But I think police brutality is something that hopefully most people, like especially white settlers, have been thinking about lately. And how police brutality impacts Indigenous communities is not a topic I'm an expert on, considering I'm not a part of those communities, but I think it's still something that we should all care about. So historically and still presently, Indigenous peoples have been and are currently being wronged by the police. So the police, you know, are supposed to serve and protect theoretically, but in reality, it's often that policing systems are systemically racist, and therefore they can't really serve and protect all. And just, I think it's important to consider that the RCMP originally were essentially tasked with displacing Indigenous peoples, so like moving Indigenous peoples to reserves. And as Indigenous peoples try to defend their land today, this role in displacement continues. So not going to play this video or anything, but I just think it's important to emphasize that police brutality is not just an American problem. It's alive and it's well in Canada. It always has been. Just in February, the Wet'suwet'en land defenders posted about this RCMP raid that happened to them. And I just want to say that I think thinking things are okay in Canada is kind of like sticking our collective settler heads in the sand. So related to policing of Indigenous peoples, mentioned today too, but especially related to the Wet'suwet'en land defenders, many Indigenous leaders are now very concerned about Bill 1 in Alberta. That's something I've recently been in contact with my medical student colleagues in Alberta about, trying to figure out if there's anything we can do. I think it's passed its third reading and received royal assent June 17th, although honestly it's hard for me to find like clear information that I can understand because I'm not a legislator or a lawyer. But from what I can tell, it seems to be essentially placing harms to the economy kind of before the rights of Indigenous people. And many feel that it's targeting Wet'suwet'en solidarity efforts in Alberta specifically at this point. And under this bill, like it was said previously, there would be significant penalties for those blocking what's deemed critical infrastructure, like including pipelines. So to me, that's really concerning because this is often the only method Indigenous people are left with to be heard, and that puts those people in danger. So maybe some listeners are thinking like, okay, Sarah, sure, but you're a medical student, like stay in your lane. But I feel like this is my lane. As a medical student, and also just like as a human being that values life, I acknowledge that police brutality kills people, and specifically it kills Black and Indigenous people. And really at this point, there's no way for white people to ignore that. And I think physicians, like hopefully mostly, become physicians to protect human life. And then I think it's logical that when human life is threatened, like in any context, those in medicine have a responsibility to intervene. And I really say responsibility because as medical students, we have social capital to do this. Like people actually listen to what we say sometimes, shockingly, that's new to me. But RCMP police brutality inflicted on land defenders in the context of the CGL pipeline is a modern day continuation of colonial violence. And like as medical students, we have to label it that way and resist it. So on the note of caring about these things and what's happening in the Wet'suwet'en territory as a medical student, I just wanted to share some reflections on the CGL pipeline and Indigenous land destruction in general from specifically my perspective as a health researcher and medical student. One thing I think it's important to reflect on in terms of why it's important for medical students to like be aware of issues like this and the environmental destruction of Indigenous lands is that in medical school, I do think this is improving, but I think often we have some like random facts sprinkled in about Indigenous people. So like in an endocrinology block, it might be like mentioned in passing that there's significant levels of type 2 diabetes amongst Indigenous populations in Canada, for example. So then I think medical students have at least like started to appreciate that Indigenous communities have been disproportionately facing health challenges. But then I think that can almost create another problem, and this is something that's talked about in the literature, but without more context, the medical students or any health student will understand kind of what issues exist, but not really why. And then the problem becomes that medical students might make their own assumptions about the reasons, and they might base those assumptions on stereotypes and misinformation about Indigenous people rather than realities. So again, using type 2 diabetes as an example, because I think it's an easy one to use, I think many medical students know that levels are higher among Indigenous people, but what's not in the mandatory curriculum, at least like at U of T so far, and maybe what should be, is that traditional diets are healthy. Access to those diets and healthy land-based activity is threatened by environmental destruction like pipelines. And we should understand the history of many communities being forcibly relocated to remote areas where store-bought food is astronomically expensive. But we don't learn that. And then I just want to say, from a health research perspective, like aside from the obvious horrible impacts that environmental contamination can it can physically make people sick, but it's also been shown quite clearly in research, in robust research, that Indigenous communities with cultural continuity are healthier. Also, I'm sure like any elder in any community could tell you that. And there's risk among settlers of thinking that Indigenous culture is like somehow a problem causing health issues, as stereotypes often suggest, but really colonization is the root of ill health here. And we know that when Indigenous people have control over their land, that's part of the cultural continuity. And if those in health want to support positive health outcomes, then cultural continuity must be supported, and therefore control of land must be supported. So I think all it takes is like a quick look at some headlines to see that Indigenous people's health is threatened by environmental destruction. Aside from just being caring people that care when others are suffering, I think those working in health have this additional responsibility to care about this. So when people like the Wet'suwet'en and land defenders ask for support, we should give it. So that brings me to the idea of recognizing our collective settler responsibility. The TRC Commission report, it has a section asking that the corporate sector in Canada observes UNDRIP when engaging in activities relating to Indigenous peoples and land. So I think when settlers see this, or like any other TRC recommendations not being implemented, we must, like at minimum, voice opposition to that and insist that these recommendations are followed. The University of Toronto has written their own final report on the TRC, which I would encourage faculty members and learners to read and reflect upon their roles in the process. And then last thing, I just wanted to share that myself and the CFMS Senior Local Officer of Climate Change and Health at U of T drafted this statement. I think Shannon will put it in the chat as well, and there's a shortened link there in the slide. But the solidarity statement is based on the Wet'suwet'en and land defenders' call for such solidarity statements in their supporter toolkit. The Faculty of Medicine community at Toronto is welcome to sign this statement. Today there's over 100 signatures. You can also find me on Twitter, and I have it pinned to the top of my Twitter for now, so people can go and sign it. I would encourage any U of T Faculty of Medicine members or learners to read it and consider signing. There's some great like embedded education links in there as well. And that's it for my presentation. These are just some references, and then I think we're doing collective questions now.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So yes, I did drop that solidarity statement into the chat if folks are looking for the link and would like to sign on. And so starting with our first question, the question is whether any of the panelists have thoughts on the significance of student, faculty, and administrative support and frontline workers collaborating as a strategy for demonstrating solidarity with Indigenous sovereignty and voicing to the institutions the importance of divesting from colonial violence actions such as fracking. So that's kind of a dense question, but I think like just to summarize, what does it mean when student activism is supported by faculty and administrative support and collaboratively led alongside frontline workers to really make change and do solidarity work such as supporting the Wet'suwet'en land defenders. So maybe we can go in order of how each speaker spoke, and if everyone wants to take up to 2 minutes to respond. So Dr. Steinbach, I'll start with you.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. Thank you all for your amazing presentations. I just wanted to mention U of T Divest, which is a link that I posted in the comments in the chat. And I urge you all to take a look at that and sign on. So there is already a campaign at the University of Toronto to divest from fossil fuels. And so this is, I think it speaks to your question I'm not sure who asked that question, but regarding faculty and students collaborating, and also staff. And, you know, the universities are a community that include many different jurisdictions. And I think that definitely this can send a really important message. And actually that we can just look back at history, that universities are really powerful. Students are a really powerful move. You know, if we look back at civil rights movement, if we look at, you know, anti-Vietnam. I'm from South America, so students have been at the forefront of struggles there. If we look at Chile, I'm from Uruguay, and that, you know, students have always worked in tandem with, you know, workers, with peasant movements, and so I think with Indigenous movements. So I think this is really, really important. So I appreciate the focus that this panel has on, you know, what is it that students can do. And I urge you to, if you want to look at this U of T divest, because I think it really speaks to the point that was being made by Diane in terms of universities have lots of money, particularly powerful ones. You know, like University of Toronto is a very wealthy university. It has a lot of investments. And if it can divest from fossil fuels, that's huge. And of course, this is what we're talking about here. In addition, we can look back at the South Africa movement, right? The anti-apartheid movement. Universities also played a pivotal role in that, divesting from South Africa. That was part of the movement. I'm from back in that time, and I remember going into governing council and standing on the tables and, you know, like demanding that U of T divest. So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you, Dr. Steinbach. And Dr. Dixon?
Divesting is super powerful. Put your money where your mouth is, I guess. So there's a huge movement to divest not only institutionally, but even in the way in which you spend your money. So you can look up all of these fossil fuel or fracking corporations that support it, and then not go there. Safeway, Save on Foods, there's other places to buy food, kind of thing, and then put your money where your mouth is where you are. But when we're talking about divestment, MD Financial, which used to have all of the physicians' portfolios, so all physicians in Canada, or most of them, had their money in MD Financial, and MD Financial with the Canadian Medical Association chose to divest all of their money from all fracking and fracking related industry. Sadly, in the past 2 years, MD Financial got bought out by Scotiabank, who does not commit to divestment. And now they've said, oh, well, they're going to do a green portfolio. A lot of environmentally conscious individuals and physicians and residents that are starting portfolios have pulled their money from MD Financial and said, you know what, before you used to be a green initiative, you used to support what we believe in ethically in terms of financial commitments, and then they pulled out. UBC, now this is an interesting story. So I was involved in UBC's divestment campaign with 350.org, which is a huge environmental organization. We had a campus-wide vote, including staff, administration, everybody, for divestment. We had a 70% or more turnout or something like that, that had everybody agreeing, we need to divest our money from oil and gas and fracking and things that we don't support as an institution. If we say we are supportive of Indigenous people and we are supportive of health, these things do not tie in with where you're getting your money. Those things are counterintuitive. The UBC at that point, this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, maybe six. Oh man, I'm getting old. 6 years ago, and UBC denied it. They said, you know, I don't care if everybody wants it. We need that money, which is not true because institutions have a lot of money and they get it from a lot of different places. Recently, December 2019, there was a unanimous decision from the Board of Governors at UBC to divest from the Trek endowment. That is 22% of their money, $381 million. They've decided to divest from, which is all fracking oil, gas money. So persistence, persistence, persistence. This has been a long fight and a long struggle that I was in 6-7 years ago, and I was feeling beaten down because it didn't matter if everybody had a voice and everybody said we don't want it. The UBC Board of Governors said, yes, we don't care what you say. But then persistence, persistence, persistence. The Faculty of Medicine in most campuses is the largest faculty because it has PT and OT and nurses and midwifery. It has all of these health kind of governing bodies. And so when the Faculty of Medicine speaks up, we have 50% of your faculty now. We have 50% of your voice of a campus. And so if we say we don't support it, then what do you have to do? It's about applying pressure constantly, constantly, constantly. And you can divest, and money speaks. That's what I got to say about that. Don't lose steam.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon.
The only thing I have to add to it is just kind of the role of allies, because I think it also, we have to recognize that within academic institutions, like Indigenous scholars are greatly outnumbered. Like there's still big barriers that exist for Indigenous students. You know, even in my faculty, like there's a couple of us, you know, like in my cohort, I have like one other Indigenous student with me. So I think really kind of building partnerships like in Indigenous and non-Indigenous allies working together and becoming a collective voice.
Thank you, Diane. And Sarah, did you have thoughts?
I don't think I can really add much to what the other speakers have said, but yeah, it's important, as they've all said.
So it looks like we're just about at the end of our time. And I wonder just if I could give the opportunity to the speakers to give one soundbite of maybe just one reminder of something you've already spoken about for a call to action, just as we close. So maybe I'll start with Dr. Steinbach.
So I'll just remind you to follow the link and sign the petition if you didn't have a chance. The call to rescind Bill 1, the Critical Infrastructure Act in Alberta, which criminalizes dissent on the pipelines, and also Sarah also talked about it. This is happening. It did get passed. It received royal assent last week. So it's really crucial to remove, to get this rescinded. This act is very dangerous. It, protesters can face $25,000 in fines. So please follow those links. Please contact us. I'll put our information in the chat as well, and so that you can email me if you want the slides. But please sign the petition and encourage your friends and family to do so as well. Put it on social media. That's what I encourage you to do today. Thank you.
Dr. Dixon, did you have a final call to action?
I'm going to second the Bill 1. And then I'm just going to remind people of something an Australian elder told me as I was doing some work. Her name is Lila Watson. She's a famous elder from Australia. And she said, "If you've come here to help me, you are wasting my time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound with mine, then let us work together." And I think that people need to hear that as we carry through.
Thank you.
Yeah, just get involved. Like, there's so much opportunity now with so many Zooms going on, like to learn information. Yeah, just get involved and educate yourselves. I think also with media, kind of have a critical lens of what's being portrayed in the media, but it's never too late to take action.
Thank you. And Sarah?
I would just remind anyone listening from the Faculty of Medicine to read the Solidarity Statement and consider signing it. You can also look at the Wet'suwet'en Supporter Toolkit. There's other ideas in there. Like I'm a medical student, so I have no money, but if you have money, you should donate for sure.
So I want to thank all of the attendees for joining us today on this really important topic. Thank you to all of our office staff and Wally, who assisted me with the IT side and the planning of this event, and a huge, really deep, heartfelt thank you to all of our speakers, Dr. Vanina Steisenbach, Dr. Willow Fixin, Ms. Diane Simon, and Ms. Sarah Hyatt. Really appreciate you being here during these really challenging times and sharing your knowledge and information with us. Once you close the webinar, you should see a survey event evaluation pop up, and there will also be one emailed out to everyone who attended tomorrow. Also, this webinar was recorded, as I said,